Hello, everyone. I'm DM Dildwarf, and welcome to the Adventure Forge stream, where we learn to hone our craft in running great tabletop role-playing games. So today I wanted to give my thoughts on the latest book that we got here. Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. Now, I've been poring over it, reading through it, a little more thoroughly than I do normally with these books. I like to just flip through them and go, oh, that's neat, and then put them down, and they collect over there until I need to use them again. But I want to get a little more in depth with this book because I wanted to make it my first review. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into this. Second, alright. So, now I have been looking forward to this book for a while because Curse of Strahd is probably my favorite official module I've run so far. Because, well, it's what got, like, my entire DMing career really kind of off the ground, because before that I was playing a family game with my brother-in-laws and my wife, and it was going good, it was fine. I was learning a lot of how to DM, and it was definitely how I cut my teeth on the system. But I started a Discord with another fellow Dungeon Master, and this was the first game I ran. And it came off to I don't want to get too much into that, but it came off to a rough start. But eventually I got a core group of about 4 players that just stuck with me. And we finished Castle Ravenloft all the way through. It took about a year, a little more than a year. And so I have, Curse of Strahd has a huge place in my heart. I will probably run it again, because I think that if I ran it again, I could do much better than I did the first time. So, maybe this is going to give, and I would definitely use some of the stuff in here to make it a little better. But let's go through what's inside this book. First, there are 3 lineages, which is a new system that they have, and I'll go into explaining what that is. They have 2 new-ish subclasses if you pay attention to the UA, or if you use the UA already. You've already seen these classes. Subclasses. So there's 2 backgrounds, only one of them being an actual new background. It's the Haunted, and then an Investigator. The Investigator is the new one. Haunted was already in the last one. I actually didn't see if there was any changes. I dislike the Haunted background. I won't get into why, but I just think it's too much work to ask the Dungeon Master to do for a background, in my opinion. It's about the same amount of work that you have to do for a Warlock. If they pick a Warlock and you want to have a fleshed out patron, which is fine because the Warlock is their class and that's important. The Haunted background just gives the player... You have to create a whole, like, why they're haunted, what's haunting them, all this stuff. There's a lot of DM's work. You could probably push it off on your player, but a lot of it's more interesting if you come up with it, because then the player gets to discover it while they play, and it's just I don't like it. I don't like it. How to make your own Dread Domains is the entire second chapter of the book, which is useful. There's also the main crux of the book, is the Domains of Dread. And there are 17 featured, they call them featured Domains of Dread, and they're each about 2 to 3 pages. And then there are 22 other, that's how they could differentiate them, Domains of Dread, which are much smaller. They're like a few paragraphs for each of those. They fit like about 2 or 3 a page for the other 22. Then they have a small section that describes how to run a horror-themed adventure with like some just general DMing advice for running a horror game. Then they also give you a first-level horror adventure that you can run that you can use as like a introduction to the Domains of Dread and how your players go in, which is good. That's a good thing to have. I think that if I was going to run a Domains of Dread, I'd probably look at that adventure first to see if that's how I want to start it. I haven't read through the entire adventure in detail. I just skimmed over it. It looks good. It's got maps. It's got NPCs. It's like, it looks as fleshed out as any adventure they've made. So I'm not doubting that it's any good. And then finally, the book wraps up with 32 different monsters. So yeah, that's what's in it. That's what you get for your money. So I'm not going to go through all of those things individually, but I do want to highlight some things that I think are very important that this book does. I also want to highlight the things that I don't find very useful. And then we're going to go through some of my favorite monsters of those 32 monsters it adds, and then I'll give you my final thoughts. So first, we're going to talk about the lineages, because I really think that this actually... I believe that this is going to be... It might be a little preview in what they're thinking of doing if they ever make a 6th edition Dungeons & Dragons. I'm not going to say if, when they make a 6th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, because it's really cool. So, but it's a little finicky with, which it doesn't fit in 5th edition that way, because they always try to make things a little more streamlined in 5th edition. This kind of adds a layer of complexity to character creation, and I wouldn't recommend having a lineage be done by a brand new player. I wouldn't even bring it up. But the way they work is they're basically like a new flavor for existing races. So, for example, there's one of the lineages in there is called a Dhampir, which is basically a half vampire. And not a vampire that has been turned by like biting and then turned into a vampire. I believe it's when... I mean, there's a couple... It actually explains a few different ways a Dhampir can come into existence, but I think the most common one is when a Dhampir mates with when a vampire mates with a non-vampire and has a child, and that child has some vampire-like qualities, but isn't undead, is actually a living creature. At least that's how they explain it in the book here. So, like, for an example, one would be, like, if you had a dwarf, and you wanted to make it a Dhampir, it would be a dwarf Dhampir, and you would replace some of its features with those of the Dhampir lineage, instead of relying 100% on everything it tells you dwarf. So that's why I think it's a little messy, because it's like, hey, here's a dwarf, you get all these features of the dwarf, but then here's a lineage, we're going to slap the lineage on top of the dwarf, and then you get your character, and it's a little messy, but I see what Wizards of the Coast is trying to do, and the reason why it's messy is because they're trying to cram this into an already existing rule set. But what I think is neat is it divorces the idea of race driving what your character is, and switching it to your character's lineage or upbringing is what determines who they are. So, for example, this is what I'm thinking. Like if we went to like bare basics, like if we were to make 6th edition and choose lineages from the start and make everything a lineage. Imagine if you were going to pick an elf, and instead of picking all the different like subtypes of elves, like wood elf or high elf or drow or eladrin, and all those different elf types, imagine instead you can pick elf, but there's not all those, you're just elf. And then on top of that, then you pick a lineage. And for example, we could do something like a Feyborn lineage. So then you would be your typical, if you were an elf, a Feyborn elf, you'd be your typical elf. You would just have the same things that elves have now. But here's the neat part. Now, what if you wanted to be a dwarf? Because I know everyone wants to be a dwarf. If you want to be a dwarf, but now you wanted to take the Feyborn lineage of a dwarf. So now, instead of being just a normal, regular dwarf, like in 5th edition, you would be a dwarf that can't be put to sleep or charmed and meditates instead of sleeps. And has all more kind of like elf-like features, but you're still a dwarf. So I like this idea because it allows you to create a lot more unique combinations of things. And it makes race more of a cosmetic choice and not really a mechanical choice. And what makes the mechanical choice is more the lineages. So I can imagine a world where you have race, lineage, background, class, and background. So what that would be is like, okay, you happen to be this color skin, you happen to be this tall, you happen to have pointy ears, like all the different, that's just all cosmetic, that's your race. Then you go, okay, what's my lineage? And that's what gives you like your run speed, maybe some special magic abilities, or all these different things that you can kind of, and then, so that's the lineages. And then you have your class, which of course then is where you get all the rest of your mechanics and all your combat stuff and all that thing. And then you have your subclasses, of course, that's part of classes, it's its own thing. And then you have your backgrounds, which would be what you were doing before you became that class. And again, it almost makes races and backgrounds kind of similar, because backgrounds tend to be more cosmetic. They have some mechanical advantages, but very little. I could see them getting rid of backgrounds completely and doing just lineages, but I feel like backgrounds do add something to your character. So I personally don't think that we should get rid of that. But I do like this idea of race, lineage, class, background as a way to create your character going forward. The unfortunate thing is we only have three lineages right now. We have Dhampir, we have Hexborn, and then we have I forget the ghost one. Real quick, they're called the Reborn. That's what they're called. Yeah, which are kind of ghost-like, like half ghosts. So you got half ghosts, half hags, and half vampires. So they're all horror themed. I mean, it's Ravenloft, so it's all going to be horror themed. But I can see them coming out with more lineages in the future, and I think that would be a good thing. It's just I think they would have to also maybe redo how they do races for it to really work. So that's lineages. So I'm going to talk now. I want to talk about the weakest part of the book, which are the domains of dread. Which is disappointing because it seems like they decided to go for quantity over quality as far as the domains go. They're fun to read. I've read most of them. They're interesting ideas that you can get a lot of inspiration from for running your own campaign. But, and here it's a big but, each domain of dread is only 2 or 3 pages. And then and that's the featured ones. The other, they call them other domains, are less. You only get a couple paragraphs. So here's what you get for each domain. So you usually get a map, and I say usually because there's a couple of the featured ones that don't come with a map. I don't know if they need. I don't think they need the 1 or 2 that they don't need one because there's not really. It takes place in kind of a small localization. It doesn't need a map. That's why they don't give them. So I'm not faulting them on not including maps for everything. They have a detailed description of the Dark Lord that is basically, I would say in charge of the domain, but that's not necessarily true based on how they describe the lore and the background of how Ravenloft works. But the Dark Lord is usually the big bad guy of the domain. So they're the one that's trapped. They're the one that's trapped in that domain, and they're the one that the entire domain is geared towards torturing for eternity, which is what these domains of dread are. They are prisons for specific people, and those specific people are tortured basically for eternity. So if you're familiar with how Curse of Strahd works, you know Strahd is the Dark Lord of Barovia, and he is basically over and over and over and over and over again tortured by the memory of Tatiana, which is the woman that killed herself trying to get away from him. And he loved her, like, super deeply. I say loved. He didn't love her, but loved. Anyway, so you also get a few, with the ones that have maps, you get a few descriptions of the landmarks within the domain, so you'll see the map and there'll be some things on there, and it'll describe what's there. And then lastly, you get some neat random tables that you can use to kind of make your specific run of that domain unique to your campaign. So, but the problem is for me, I'm a very lazy dungeon master. So when I read these domains of dread, I'm not getting any more than if I read like a Cliff Notes version of my favorite fantasy horror novel, or basing a Dungeons & Dragons novel on it. You could go to any wiki, pick out any movie, any game world that you want to run, and you could find more information on that game world just doing a research than you get out of these domains of dread. Which makes this book not really like the quintessential Domain of Dread book. It's just one that has some minor descriptions of the ones that they've decided to flesh out. But when I say like flesh out, it's only like 2 or 3 pages, so it's not really even fleshed out. Each one of these Domains of Dread have the potential for them running an entire campaign just like Castle Ravenloft did, but you have to do the work yourself. You have to decide it all. And that's unfortunate because I'm lazy and I'm not going to do them. Most likely. That's me. You might be different. You might find these awesome and inspiration and you love doing all that work. That's great. I'm not going to do that work for every single campaign I run. So I don't... that part of the book is completely useless for me. What I will say, though, is... you could... The way I would run the campaign, if I was, and would use this book, I would run a campaign that takes place in the domains of Dread, and I would pick like 5 or 6 of the domains and link them all together, and we would run an adventure that traverses all of them throughout the course of the campaign. Because if you take a bunch of them and string them together, you actually then have enough information that you might be able to create a campaign without doing a whole bunch of extra work, and have like one adventure in each domain. And that would be something I would do. That's how I would run it if I were forced to. You put a gun to my head, that's how I would do it. The only thing that's a small problem with that is the way they describe the mist. The way they describe the mist is it's a fog that encompasses and surrounds all of the domains of Dread and separates them. So it's supposed to be intraversable by normal people, basically, and only a select few can traverse the fog. So what you'd have to do is you'd have to give your players the ability to traverse the fog, or you'd have to kind of like railroad them by being like, oh, the fog encompasses you, and then you appear in a different domain. Like, it's not really that, like, neat of a thing. I think it's a little... I'd probably just make the mist this magical gateway, and maybe make like a map that connects all the domains of Dread, and then make it so that the players can traverse that only at specific times or specific ways. But anyway, that's how I would see it working. But like I said, I would have to do all that work myself, and I'm lazy, so I probably wouldn't do it. So, I will say this though. So with the Domains of Dread, they have all the domains that they fleshed out, and then the smaller ones that they kind of just give you little samples of. The chapter on creating your own Domain of Dread, which is funny because I say I'm a lazy dungeon master, but I would totally use this, because I wouldn't use it to create my own Domain of Dread. I would use it to create my own adventures, because there's a whole bunch of cool stuff in there, and lots of random tables and lots of ideas and how to make your own what do they call it, dark lord. So how to create your own dark lord, and it's all sorted by horror genre. So the whole chapter 2, you can go through all the genres and be like, okay, well, I want to run a cosmic horror adventure. So you go to the cosmic horror section and you read through that and you start building your big bad evil guy, the Dark Lord, but you could that's your bad guy. It helps you build that. And then you could use also the Dungeon Master's Guide has some great tools also to create bad guys and come up with their inspirations for what they're doing and what the players are going to try to thwart them from. Then so then you go through that, and then it comes with a bunch of other adventure ideas of how you can create this horror adventure. And that's what I would use chapter 2 for, not creating a Dread domain, to just create an adventure with, because it's got a lot of cool, neat ideas that that they're sorted by genre. Makes it really fun to think about and come up with, and it's be like, I want to do a Cthulhu-like thing. So you go to the cosmic horror section, and you just read through that, and you figure out what kind of horror adventure you want to run there. So I'm 100% certain that within the next, 6 months, I'm probably going to write an adventure, it'll be horror, and I'll use Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft to help me build that adventure. 100%. So, the last thing I wanted to touch on was monsters. Because, personally, I can never get enough of the monsters. So, what we're going to do for that is we're going to do... hold on. We'll do this here. Get this set up. There we go. Aha! Alright, so I've got D&D Beyond here with the monsters that I wanted to highlight that I think are unique, cool, It's things that I would maybe build a campaign around, or at least an adventure. Maybe not a whole campaign. So the first one I want to highlight, we're going to kind of go order. We're going in the order they appear in the book, just because easy. Alphabetical. I think that falls in alphabetical order, so that's nice. So the first one I want to talk about is the Body Taker plant. So if you've ever seen the movie, or like what's it called? Attack of the Body Snatchers, I believe, or Invasion of the Body Snatchers. That's basically what this is. So, one second, I'm sorry. So it's got a great stat block if you just go through it. So the speed's slow. It can only move 10 feet at a time, but it's cool. It's got 10 feet of climb, swim, and regular, so it can move kind of across anything. But look at these stats. We got boom, 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 boom. Like high above the board, except for Dex. And that makes sense because they're slow and they're plants. But honestly, that's actually higher than most plants, so that's cool. This stuff doesn't really matter too much. I'm not like it's basic plant stuff, but except this blind sight is 120 feet, so that's huge. So the idea that I think with this is, imagine this is a perfect creature to like attack your if your party is sleeping in the woods. And there's a body taker plant nearby, 120 feet away. He slowly, over time, just starts 10 feet at a time, creeping towards them. And eventually attacking them. With their 20-foot reach Vine Lash. And it makes 3 of these Vine Lash attacks. So, it's kind of weird. It can make 3 of these attacks, but it has 4 vines. And each vine can grapple 1 target. So, I mean, it's really cool because it also does the damage and grapples them. A lot of monsters in D&D, usually it's like, it does damage or you can grapple them. This one is like, nah, you can have both. And that's fine. That's great. So this is cool. Then its second attack is the Entrapping Pod. So what this basically does is does more damage, acid damage, as it basically pulls... It only works on a grappled creature, and it works automatically. There's no roll to avoid this, but there is a roll to avoid being stunned. If you get swallowed by this thing, you have to roll a con save to see if you're stunned. So it's a really good way to pop a creature out. You can only fit 1 creature inside of this body taker at a time. So that's what it would be like fighting it. But I think the thing that makes this thing unique and cool is the second is this part down here, where it says the enveloped target doesn't require air and gains 1 level of exhaustion for each hour it spends inside. So regardless of the acid damage it took, which it only takes 1 time when it gets swallowed, anything can only exist in there for 6 hours, because if you remember, exhaustion works if you get to 6th level of exhaustion, you die. So 6 hours later, if the target dies, it immediately emerges from the pod as what's called a podling. Now, a podling, they don't have a picture for it because a podling is basically a duplicate, a doppelganger of the person. They're still plant type, but they look exactly like the person that got swallowed. They act exactly like the person that's swallowed. And they can go back and they enter the world. So the thing that's neat about them is you could start... The idea would be like in your head as the DM, you'd think, okay, well, 1 body taker plant would probably put itself in a forest somewhere. And then as hunters or people who venture into the forest, it would swallow 1, send it back into the town. And then that one would then start bringing more people into the forest to then get converted. And then eventually, what I'm thinking is, I don't know if the podlings themselves become body taker plants at some point, or if they have to, then maybe the body taker plant has to give them seeds. Hey, go plant more of me somewhere. And then that's how they spread and become more, and then you could have another body taker plant and another body taker plant. So what would be cool, what I think would be cool, is if your players go to a village, go to a town that they get familiar with, they do quests, they quest around, it's fun, and they figure all that stuff, then they leave for a while, and they go off and do adventures somewhere else. If they come back to this town, how cool would it be if they come back to this town and all of the NPCs they talk to are just a little off? And what's cool is they got this little podling behavior chart it gives you a little d6 you could roll on, or maybe just pick from for the NPCs on what little weird quirk does it have that makes it different and weird that they didn't notice last time. Like somebody who likes being naked and resents wearing clothing and resents their hair. So like somebody that maybe had beautiful hair before, they shaved off all their hair and are running around wearing like next to no clothing now. And everybody's just kind of like okay with it, but you're like, well, why the hell is this person running around naked now? And just like things like that. So then when they come back, everything's just slightly off. And then they could discover one of these body taker plants, maybe in the basement of one of these towns, or of one of the NPCs' homes. Or they could, you could go bonkers with this body taker plant. You can have a bunch of them. There could be a room that has like 4 or 5 of them, and that's like the big final encounter with a bunch of these podlings there to defend it. And it would be great. I think it would be a really cool campaign to run, and I would love to run one using these podlings. The next creature we have is it's a cat-like creature that messes with spellcasters, which is a favorite pastime of mine. I love messing with spellcasters because I think spellcasting has the potential to break your encounters. So being able to have a creature that goes, haha, I'm going to break your magic casting, that seems fun to me. So what these cats do is they have a bite attack. It's nothing special. They are only CR18. They're not a threat, and that's the thing. That's what makes them cool. You could fill a room with like 10 of them, describe them as basically hairless cats, and your players won't think twice about it. They'll be like, oh, I want to pet the cat, blah, blah, blah. But now imagine you put it in a room with a bad guy that you want to kind of protect a little bit, and he has all these cats, he or she has all these cats, and fight breaks out. Spells start getting slammed. Now, within 30 feet of a Gremshka, if any spell is cast, they can use as their reaction, and then they roll on this dice to do the effect. Most of the time, it's just a little bit of damage. Or it's damage, or it heals a little bit. And with 10 HP, these things are getting one shot, most likely. Unless it's like level 1s or 2s. But I wouldn't really worry too much about the healing. So they're either going to do damage, but then on a 5 or a 6, wait, what does it say? The Grimishka explodes and dies, and then a swarm of Grimishkas appear instantly in the space where that Grimishka died. So that's insane. So imagine you're swinging spells, and they'd be like, okay, that spell you just slung, the cat over there explodes, and now there's a swarm of them in their place. So now we're going to go to the swarm and see what that does. So it's not just a swarm of these things, it's almost like a completely different creature. Now, instead of having this magic allergy, that's how they describe this reaction, they get spell immunity for level 3 spells and below, which is awesome. So if you throw firebolts at it, not going to work. You throw anything less than 3 or level, even a fireball won't work on this thing. So that's insane. The swarm can occupy another people, so it's like a normal swarm. But it's got a bite that does some extra force damage, and then it's based on how much damage it's taken. It's like a swarm. The one that's really neat, though, and what best is with spellcasters, is if a spell attack rolls and misses the swarm. So that's going to be any spell 3 or below is going to be affected by this reaction. And then if you cast a spell that's higher than that, and it misses, it'll be affected by this. So what this does is it redirects the spell to another creature of its choice within 30 feet that it can see. So you see this big swarm of Grimishkas coming at you. You're like, fireball. Nope. Fireball's coming back at you. I don't know how that would it even work with a fireball? It's a spell attack roll, so it wouldn't work as a fireball because the fireball's not an attack roll. Alright, so it'll only be things like Firebolt or things that are targeted spell attacks. But still, that's pretty cool. That it can just mess with players like that. So like, if you do it once and then one of these cats pops into this swarm of Grimishkas, your spellcaster is all your spellcasters are gonna second guess, be like, well, there's like 10 of these cats in here. One of them just turned into a swarm. Can the other ones do that too? And they're gonna think twice about casting spells. And now your big bad evil guys basically like got an advantage, especially if they're not a spellcaster themselves. They're like, oh, now you can't cast spells at me without risking making this whole thing worse. It's pretty great. Yeah, I love this. I love the idea of this thing. I'm going to use these probably to protect a big bad guy at some point. All right, so the next one is who likes a good slasher flick? And if you want to run a nice, good slasher pick as your D&D campaign, there's 2 creatures in the book that are called Relentless. I'm highlighting the Juggernaut here because it's the more powerful of the 2. The other one's a CR8 that's similar to this, a little different flavor. But the idea is they're like your slasher bad guys. They're going to relentlessly pursue you until you die. So they're a great big bad evil guy for something like this. Now, the way I would think to use this is use it against a low-level party. So at CR 12, level 4 or 5, probably I wouldn't go higher than level 5 because if you get a good optimized group of level 5 creatures, they could probably stand toe-to-toe against this thing. So maybe level 4, not too much below that, but the idea is think Pyramid Head or Mr. X from those video games, those survival horror video games. That should be this guy. This guy should... that way. That's this guy. This guy should be when the players turn the corner and they see this guy standing in the hallway and he turns to look at you. Your players should turn and run from it because it's going to one-shot, it's going to catch you and murder you. That's how I'd run this thing. And then eventually maybe the players get strong enough to stand their ground, or maybe they never do. Maybe they just go through the entire adventure running away from this thing. And I think that would be great. It's got legendary actions. It's got legendary resistances. The other, the non-Juggernaut, I forgot what the other one was called. Called the Relentless something or other. Yeah, is that him? Yeah. The Relentless Slasher. So he is the... Oh, he's got legendary... He's slightly less legendary than this one. He's only got 1 legendary resistance, but he still has 3 legendary actions, so... But that would be like, I would imagine your more typical, like, that would be like your Freddy or Jason style murderer. This is more like Mr. X or Pyramid Head, in my opinion. That's how I would run this guy. That would be pretty great. You could even just probably reskin this dude as Pyramid Head and run a Silent Hill adventure if you wanted. I think that would be perfect use of this stat block. 100%. And the last guy I want to kind of go over is what they call the Starspawn Emissary. So this is a cosmic horror creature. So it's your Cthulhu-esque old god style creature. And he's CR 19 in his lesser form, or in its lesser form, and then it's CR 21 in its greater form. This is, I would run this as a campaign level big bad guy. Now, what's really cool is the reason why the lesser one doesn't have a picture, just like the podlings don't have a picture, is because it can look like anything, anyone, any creature, at any time. It has changed shape that basically lets it polymorph into anything. So what that lets you do as DM is you can insert this guy as an NPC or as multiple different NPCs that interact with the players. Or maybe they don't interact with the players, they're just around. And they're lurking in the background. And the whole idea is the players really don't know the danger that this creature presents. And then all these things are happening around this thing. And the whole player's job is to figure out what is going on. And maybe they have to fight different bad guys and they have to level up and they're figuring things out until they finally corner this guy. Now what's great is the idea, and it's just built into the stat block, is when it's cornered and when it has... Oh, I also want to quote some things, the description. So let's, if they discover the true nature of this creature, either through like maybe a true sight spell or anything that lets them view the true form of something. I'm going to quote right here. Should it reveal its true form, an emissary appears as a roughly bipedal mass of agitated organs, self-cannibalizing alien orifices and appendages suggestive of forms that it previously assumed. So it's horrifying. It's body horror craziness. And what would be neat is if only one player like maybe saw that maybe like for a moment or a brief moment, or maybe just like a really good insight check. He sees something off on the guy. That would be fantastic. So what would happen though is if the emissary is like, okay, the jig is up, time to reveal my true form. This isn't even my true form or my final form. Here's his final form. Is the greater Starspawn emissary, which becomes, I'm going to quote again because I think the descriptions are great. It rises as a 25-foot tall pillar of violent flesh, amalgamating the meat and voices of every form the emissary has ever mimicked. Manifestations of alien hunger erupt from this horror in waves of ravenous organs and mind-breaking psychic assaults. So, this creature becomes a 25-foot tall pillar of flesh and bone and appendages. And look, you can see some tentacles in there. You see teeth mixed in. But it looks like a rat snout with like a bunny ear and a wolf nostril. Like, it's just everything it ever pretended to be all at once. Horrifying. And then, like, I'm not even going through the stats because to me, like, this stuff, it'll be great. Like, it's great mechanically for to use it. It's got high damaging attacks. It's got legendary actions. You can read all this stuff yourself. It's got legendary resistances, and then it's even more powerful in its final form. Yeah, it is. I would love to run a Cthulhu-style campaign with the Starspawn. And then there's I believe it's. I don't think it's in the monster manual. But there are other Starspawn creatures, which are basically Dungeons and Dragons version of cosmic horror entities. And they could be easily used as the fodder and the rank and file leading up to the greater Starspawn, who ends up being the puppet master behind the scenes, which is kind of what they were missing. This fills the gap for the Starspawn creatures as a whole, where now you could probably run a whole campaign with Starspawn as your big bad guys, and run aberrations, and run this cosmic horror reality melting campaign. And it would make an awesome climax to finish it off with a big final confrontation with the greater Starspawn emissary. These monsters, they are very well thought out. They fill gaps that are missing in all the other monster manuals. They're very smartly done. And they're all horror themed, so I mean, you can use them outside of horror. You don't have to you can use the Relentless Juggernaut as an NPC, just like a big bad guy that you just want to be tough and powerful and big bruiser. But they're great. So I'm gonna say my final thoughts on this book. Let's hide this back. Let's just pop back here. There we go. My final thoughts. It's a mixed bag for me. I love that the tools they give for adventure writing. I love the player character options. There's only a few, but they're good. And very memorable monsters. All the monsters, like even the ones I didn't mention, there's no stinkers in there really. There's a couple that are like pretty generic, but they're low CR. They're meant to just fill, but for the most part, really good monsters. It's just too bad that the Domains of Dread, even though they're really well written, they're not very fleshed out. So they seem to have gone for quantity over quality with the Domains of Dread, and only because the Domains of Dread takes up like at least half of this book as far as pages go. That's what's disappointing of it. I'm gonna give this book 3 out of 5 undulating appendages. But that's Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. I wouldn't say it's an essential. Unless you really want to run horror games. If you want to run horror games, this is probably... this is more of like, instead of it being a source book for campaign source book, it's more like a Dungeon Master's Guide for horror. That's kind of what it feels like to me if you just pull out all the Domains of Dread and ignore them. Everything else in it is tools to run horror games in Dungeons and Dragons if you just ignore the Domains of Dread, which is unfortunate because they're so not very fleshed out. Alright, that was my review. I hope you enjoyed it.